Welcome, friends, to episode 4 of the School Transportation Nation podcast. Episode today is brought to you by TransFinder, the leader in school bus routing software. They are pleased to bring you this episode of the STN podcast, where we talk about school districts' new mission in response to the coronavirus. I'm your host, Tony Corpin, president and publisher of School Transportation News. I am joined by Mr. Ryan Gray, editor-in-chief of School Transportation News. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me once again.
Well, friends, we're going to jump into some really great discussion today about how COVID-19 is really going to permanently change how the student transportation industry is going to really have to adapt to this new normal. Later on, we will have Tim Ammon, expert in transportation from Decision Support Group, joining us for a look at what districts should be doing in preparation for the 2021 school year. First, we're going to jump into Ryan with our weekly update on the coronavirus to discuss what's going on, the impact districts. Ryan, you want to lean in and tell us a little bit what's going on?
Well, the new normal is proceeding. Many of the school districts and states across the nation, of course, have closed school buildings for the remainder of the school year. They continue to have class. So we've moved to predominantly an online distance learning model. So students from kindergarten all the way up through high school, they are at home, locked down per the various governors' stay-at-home orders, trying to figure out what to do next. Obviously, the school busing has stopped as we have grown to know it, delivering food still, delivering Wi-Fi in those areas where that is available on school buses via routers. But really, the industry is trying to figure out its next steps. So I know we're going to talk about budgets in a little bit with Tim Ammon, and certainly he'll have some thoughts to share in what he's seeing with his clients. But really, it's what does school busing look like once the schools open up again? And likely that will be for 2020, 2021 school year. So just this week when we were airing this podcast, President Trump came out with a 3-step phase into reopening America. And it's really going to rely on what the health experts and the public health community is dictating in terms of best practices. But it really seems that physical distancing or social distancing is here to stay. Harvard University, in fact, this week also said that if no vaccine is finalized soon, that we could be facing physical distancing through the end of 2022. What does that look like for our society as a whole, and especially for school transportation? So a lot of the conversations right now at the state level are falling along the lines of how do we prepare not only our school buses, but our employees for when school magically reopens again and we start transporting students. So I was talking to someone earlier today, and in her state, she was saying that a lot of the conversation is talking about erecting plexiglass that would separate the school bus driver from the students. I've heard some people talk about, does this mean that school bus drivers need to be wearing hazmat suits? Certainly, with all of the requirements in local municipalities to be wearing face masks, certainly see that continuing. So there's a lot of questions, not many answers. Some of these were touched on during a webinar earlier this week, which is hosted and presented by TransFinder, who of course is the sponsor of this webcast, with the 3 national associations, and a lot of questions from folks asking about school startup. So we're really following this evolving pattern of this virus and trying to figure out what the next steps are. Really, we don't know. That's kind of the takeaway that we're at right now. Again, a lot of conversations. What does social distancing physical distancing look like on a school bus? Someone told me recently that they're looking at the reduction. So if they're taking the requirements that people stay 6 feet apart. So what does that look like on an average 72 passenger school bus? They ran some calculations and found that only 14 kids could be transported. And this is, assuming that the students are in general ed. What about students who are in special needs programs, students who have IEPs? What about monitors that need to be riding these school buses per student IEPs as caregivers? So there's a lot of concern right now, and we really need to see how this shakes out.
Yeah, really interesting, Ryan. I mean, I think, will a vaccine come? I mean, God, I think every pharma company in the world is working to try to put something out feverishly. I think I saw Johnson and Johnson says they'll have a vaccine by 2021. But this is all kind of the media week to week. I feel like man, I've been in coronavirus. It feels like a year, right? It's been a month. So time feels like it's a bit standing still to some degree, but so much information overload comes every week, right? I mean, you see the stock markets moved up this last week, and where does that hold? And that isn't always an economic indicator of how the economy is doing. It's just people are seeing future, what's the opportunity and how does that affect school transportation, right? And all the suppliers, and that business conversation is going on out there with the old paycheck protection plan, the PPP, are the companies that are supplying the school bus industry, are they getting the funds to help support their businesses? And then turn, those businesses are going to support the school districts and the contractors on the products and services they need. And I feel like it's kind of just a domino effect to some degree. And there's just so many things and unknowns out there that it really can create almost a paralysis. How do you move forward? How without knowing information? I have one of my staff members call me and we're talking about STN Expo Indianapolis, right? And it's in June. That's when the planned time was. And we've been working really hard to reschedule that show. And it's very hard when you're working with a lot of other stakeholders. And we've been able to move forward on doing a rescheduling. We're going to make an announcement on those new dates very soon in the fourth quarter. And that's the goal, right? How do we get there? But they're like, hey, how do we plan for that next thing? And I'm like, you can't. You got to just keep planning as if we're going to have it and everything's going to keep moving forward. And if you do that, the hope is that you're going to be in good shape if things turn the corner. If they don't, you got to adapt, right? I think that's the new normal, right? You have to be adaptive and flexible. You can't live in the old box that this is the way it always was. It's not doable. It's just not advisable in this environment. We've never seen anything like this before. Everyone tries to compare it to other times, and it's not. And I know Tim's going to jump into that and talk a little more about that topic. And so I don't want to go too far down that road. But I mean, Ryan, with respect to what you're seeing in terms of where businesses are going to support the school district in terms of products, services. Maybe that's manufacturers. I think IC Bus is the only OEM that's currently still manufacturing right now. A lot of the other manufacturers have shut down for a few weeks with hopes of reopening. What else are you hearing around that, Ryan?
Well, really, most companies are trying to figure out a way, first of all, to keep their employees on the payroll. Because again, that's the stipulation of the PPP program. So they're altering their manufacturing if they are manufacturing. And I saw that General Motors is essentially not creating or not manufacturing any new vehicles right now. They're working on ventilation systems that are necessary, that are needed in hospitals. You have heavy duty bus parts, which we mentioned in the last podcast, that has switched to creating PPDs, personal protection devices. We're seeing that from several other companies as well, creating hospital beds. HSM is doing that. There's just, everyone is trying to adapt to this new normal. So, like you said, this is incredible times. And the cream will really rise to the top here of ingenuity. That's what has always made our country great. And it's nothing like a crisis to really bring out the best in people. So we know that coming out of World War II, which we learned this week, we've hit the worst unemployment level since then. Obviously, there's been a big change in our demographics and our population size in the U.S., but all things considering, with 22 million people this week alone that are claiming unemployment, that's incredible, and it's supposed to just continue to rise. So we're something like 14% unemployment rate when we were at like 2.5 or 3%. It's just crazy. So companies are trying to do everything they can to stay in business. They're seeing what their capabilities are, working with their supply chain however they can, just to keep the wheels turning. So we're just going to continue to see that. And again, how this affects the school bus industry. We have all these conversations about what's transportation going to look like. What will student transporters need? What will school buses need? I mentioned, potentially plexiglass. That's what one state is looking at doing. So that just will provide further opportunities for some of these companies. But certainly it's not business as normal.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the conversation out there where there's a collaboration, I think, between it's Apple and Google, if I'm not mistaken, on tracing, right? Using technology to trace, if you've been in contact with someone, but you have to opt in for that. But that's a leveraging of technology and how it could potentially work at scale. And so a lot of these kind of very innovative, but God, it feels like it's a movie, like a Minority Report or something like that, where very big brother, you're being tracked, and not everybody's going to want that, but a lot of people will want to know maybe if they've come into contact with someone to take the necessary steps to try to not infect others or take those kind of those protective measures to help their loved ones. So it's just really a complicated situation. I mean, Ryan, you hit on the staffing component of this with all those people unemployed. Is that companies just saying, hey, take unemployment because the federal government is supporting that? So is that number higher than it probably should be because companies are making the choice to say, hey, we're going to let you go get that money when normally maybe you wouldn't be able to, or you're going to be better off. So those numbers look a bit inflated. So when those companies come back on, the V curve, unemployment goes way up on a V curve, but does it come way down on the V curve too? So will we see that? I mean, I think those are a lot of things that people will be looking at in the coming weeks. Is what point do you hit that kind of that peak of unemployment and it starts to go down the other direction, kind of like coronaviruses, right? And how many people, when you hit that peak and it goes down the other way, what's that going to look like and when? And, I know there's a lot of crisis in this market with the driver shortage and mechanic shortage. Is there a potential positive or is there a negative, right? Like it's not like it was in the past. And I think those are big questions that need to be answered, or if you're not talking about it, you should be. And how do you recruit and do that? But I think technology is really a great way to leverage opportunities in this space. Speaking of technology, our podcast sponsor, TransFinder, is pleased to announce the release of its much anticipated web-based routing solution, Route Finder Plus. The faster, safer, smarter Route Finder Plus is available for any school to test drive for free in the safety of their home. In this time of uncertainty, Plus will put this powerful routing platform at your fingertips. To learn more about these solutions, go to transfinder.com or email getplus, that's PLUS, at transfinder, TransFinder.com. Be the first in your state to mention this podcast, the School Transportation Nation podcast, number 4 in the email to receive an Amazon gift card. Next up on the podcast, we have Tim Ammon of Decision Support Group. He will shed more light on many of the topics Ryan and I just spoke about. Really excited to have him on the show. Coming on up. We're here with Tim Ammon from Decision Support Group. co-owner. Tim has been working with school districts and state agencies for more than 20 years, trying to solve problems and answer questions about how to efficiently provide student transportation. His work has focused on everything from funding formulas to bell time studies to insourcing and outsourcing and technology use, implementation. Tim has presented on a broad range of topics at STN Expo, and his latest areas of interest are in leadership, decision-making, and organizational strategy. Tim has also prepared a blog for STN. Be sure and head to blogs on stnonline.com to see what he has to say. So, Tim, wanted to jump into the conversation. We've known each other a long time, been through a lot, seen a lot in the industry over the many years. I mean, I've been in the industry 16 years. You're even longer, 20 years. So, I guess a couple of vets wrapping out here about what's going on. And I mean, what do you think? Similar, different of this massive disruption in our industry?
Yeah, Tony, thanks. First off, I really do want to thank you and Ryan and all the folks at STN for putting out all the great information that you do. You've been incredibly supportive of me and the companies that I've worked for over the years, and I'm really grateful for that. And we have certainly seen a lot of challenges, and while this one is a huge one, I'm confident that the industry will be able to rise to the occasion. And I think that a big concern of mine is this idea that this one is the same as all of the others, because the most obvious similarity that's going to be prevalent this time is that this is going to be really painful for a lot of people. And it's going to require the industry to rethink a lot of the preconceptions and maybe misperceptions that it has about service delivery. And at least for some portions of the country, service delivery is not going to return to normal, whatever that means, for a really long time. And as a result, I think what we need to do is focus on building resiliency and flexibility into transportation operations. And other than the pain, though, I think this time things are going to be different. And that's primarily because this is not purely a financial crisis like what occurred after 9/11 or occurred during the mortgage crisis. This is a public health crisis that has a financial component to it. So it's likely to me that it's going to result in a number of reconsiderations about how educational services are going to be provided, which ultimately will filter down into transportation. Ryan mentioned a lot of them in his portion of the conversation with you, talking about things like, what are we going to do if drivers are wearing PPE? How are we going to make sure that they focus on the road? If social distancing is going to continue to be the norm, what's that going to mean in terms of bus stop placement and bus stop assignments? What's it going to mean in terms of the way that we load and unload kids at schools? What if we have to deal with things like alternative day assignments, or even treating everybody as if it's a half-day kindergarten and that half the kids are going to school in the morning and half are going in the afternoon? Those are fundamental changes to the way that services are being delivered. And I think it's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on the industry to do things differently. And I think, unfortunately, what it's going to do is it's going to slow a lot of systems down and result in much less efficiency than people traditionally plan for. And I think that's a huge concern, because our answer in this industry to most crises is we'll get more efficient. We'll find a way to redesign the routes. We'll find a way to change the bell times, to use fewer buses, that cut down on the number of drivers that we need. And I'm of the opinion that at least for some time here, we are unlikely to be able to do a lot of those things. And so if we can't do that, what can we do? And I think that's where my focus on the idea of building in flexibility, resiliency, and responsiveness comes from. And I suspect that the biggest change for folks is that we are going to really need an enormous amount of innovation, thoughtful leadership, and disciplined decision-making to make all this happen. Because I think you posed the question earlier in the discussion about what might this do to the driver shortage? Could this be helpful in some way to that, as perverse as that may sound? And I'm actually a believer in the idea that I don't think it will. I actually think this might make it worse. And maybe it's not going to get worse out of the gate in August and September, but I think certainly in November, December, if there starts to be a recurrence of this thing, things are going to get worse. Because if there's an additional period of shutdown that results in a second round of layoffs, I think that's going to end up with people who have been in the industry for a while leaving permanently. And if those folks start leaving permanently, I don't know what we do. That's going to require a tremendous amount of leadership across all of the stakeholders in this industry.
Yeah, that's interesting you said that because, I've definitely seen a bit of a transition, right? This industry is, you hear that common story of I started as a driver or a mechanic and I moved up the ranks and I've been in transportation for 15, 20, 30 years and now I'm the director. And those directors are, they got a year or 2 years to retire. Does this speed up their potential retirement? They're like, hey, maybe they don't want to leave, but maybe the district is saying, hey, maybe you take early retirement. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen there, but we've definitely seen a generational transition happening in the market where you've got that kind of knowledge and it's almost a tribal knowledge. And you're seeing younger directors come in and kind of do it their own way or a new way. And that's creating some shift in the market. But this is, again, not like anything anyone has seen before, right? So, I mean, it's clear the news is going to impact budgets. Transportation budgets are sure to get impacted. I mean, if not in 2021, beyond, it will definitely be impacted. And I think many districts and directors and superintendents, assistant soups are probably all having those conversations because, right, we're on the border of budgeting right now in July. And I think it's really interesting to hear what people are saying because I'm getting a mixed bag out there. But how do you think transportation leaders need to prepare themselves to respond to the fiscal challenges that are coming out of this shutdown?
Yeah, I think the challenges are going to be significant. And I also think that one of the first things that people need to do is to separate the disruption caused by the virus from the economic disruption. The virus is horrible, for sure. There's no doubt about it. But I actually believe that the economic disruption is going to be much more broader based and as a result is going to have much more of an impact on the industry generally. Because there are a bunch of communities around the country that have not suffered in the same way that places like New York and New Jersey and New Orleans and some of those places have. But all of those communities are tied together inside supply chains in some way, shape, or form. And if we continue to have increasing unemployment and other economic dislocation that reduces the demand for goods and services, this thing is going to have massive impacts. Because if you look at just the unemployment claims per 100,000 people in the workforce, there's a huge number of similarities across all of the states. And those similarities don't necessarily correlate super well with the heavy presence of the virus. There was an article this week in Bloomberg on this. And I think that to me is a really strong indicator that the breadth of these two things are both going to be large, but the economic disruption will hit more communities and it will hit many of those communities deeper than the disruption from the virus. And let's face it, if you put 22 million people out of work, it's going to be an issue no matter what, no matter how quickly those folks get jobs again. This means that this isn't going to be a short-term blip. This isn't going to be something that we ride out for a little while, right? I'm no economist, so I don't know whether the recovery is going to be V-shaped or U-shaped or W-shaped or L-shaped or whatever letter in the alphabet you want to pick. But what I do know is that when there are such massive drops in revenue, whether they're for companies or tax revenues into governments, that's not good for any organization. And it's going to require everybody listening to this podcast to start making some very sobering decisions about how to manage their businesses and their organizations over the next couple of years. My guess is it's likely that places where there's a heavier reliance on income and sales taxes, places like Florida, Tennessee, Nevada, where there's tourism and income tax or no state income tax. Those places are going to feel this sooner. But if you look at Oklahoma and Texas and the impact that the changes in oil prices are having on them, that's happening concurrently and maybe as a result and related to everything that's going on. And then I think there's been a fundamental shift in the way that education funding and consequently transportation funding comes down to school districts. We put up an article from the Brookings Institute on our company LinkedIn page about this that just talks about that shift in how, as state revenues start to change, the revenues that go to districts and consequently the revenues that go to transportation are going to get impacted almost no matter what. And so I think we really need to be thoughtful about that. Fortunately, there's been some things that have happened that are helpful, right? The CARES Act funding is going to be helpful. The Federal Reserve backstopping municipal debt is really going to help stabilize some of those governments. But there's a huge denominator problem here, right? So the CARES Act had $3 billion in block grant funding for schools for general ed use. And that sounds like a lot of money. And of that, Pennsylvania was supposed to get about $104 million, for example, right? Which again, sounds like a lot of money, except there are 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. So in effect, if it's given out evenly, all of those school districts are going to get roughly $200,000 apiece. That's not a lot of money in this environment. So we're going to have to be really thoughtful about the way we think about and the way that we approach budgeting, not only for the 2021 school year, but certainly for the next several after that. And I think if people are looking at their calendar, one of the things that we have to note is the next fiscal year is only about 75 days away. So there are some places that are going to limp through it. There are some places that are going to get hurt right away. But I think we really need to begin to focus on the issue of controlling costs and identifying what that means to individual districts.
Tim, a lot of districts, they're not operating, but they had money in their budgets from this year that may be sitting there, like fuel. People aren't using that, labor. Are districts going to find themselves reallocating those monies? Is it like we've got the use it or lose it kind of like, hey, do they have to spend that money this fiscal year? Or do you see the school districts redirecting those funds in different ways? How are you seeing that affect your clients? Is that something you're being talking about with your customers?
Yeah, I think there will be some carryover allowances from funding for this year. And it's one of the things you certainly see in conversations related to payments to bus contractors, as you had Corey talking about last week. So, I think it's interesting to see what's going to happen in that regard. But ultimately, we're 10 months into the fiscal year. And so the amount of money that's left isn't going to be enough, in my opinion, to cover the hole that's created. So I think that there's going to have to be a lot of creativity across really three dimensions when we think about it. And I think the first one is going to be the issue of thinking about routing, because ultimately it's the same as why people rob banks, right? Like that's where the money is. So we've got to go there and we've got to start to think about what we can do. And I think if I'm a transportation director that's sitting in a state that was negatively impacted by the virus, one of the things I better be getting familiar with pretty quickly is the day variant aspects of my routing software. And because I think we're going to have kids going to school on alternate days. And so I need to be able to make sure that I've got Monday routes and Tuesday routes and Wednesday routes, and I'm able to manage all of that. And I think that one of the interesting things that you and Ryan both spoke about and alluded to in the earlier part of the conversation is this idea of partnerships. And I think we're going to have to get more creative on partnerships as well. And that's whether it's a district partnering with a traditional bus contractor or some of the alternative service providers like Hop Skip Drive or Zoom or ALC or multiple contractors partnering together with a district or a regional agency. I think we're going to have to do a better job of using the resources that are out there because there isn't going to be enough funding to pay for all of them. And then the last thing that I think that we're going to have to worry about on that is the issue of when are we going to take care of these things? I worry about the issue of as buses are out running around and providing more hours of service, when are we going to maintain them? What are we going to do with that? Finding technicians is as difficult as finding bus drivers. And so we're going to have to look at things like shift schedules and PM schedules. And, you had an interesting article out on STN Online this week about some of the regulatory relief that was happening in Indiana. And I think more states are going to have to be thinking about that as we go forward.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, you talk a lot about planning there for the future, and there are a lot of things that are still uncertain. And, how do you suggest transportation leaders, departments start building a path forward to, what comes next as school opens? Like, what is that next step, Tim? I mean, guide us, help us out here.
Sure. Yeah, I think a major saving grace for the educational system generally is that the people in this industry, the people who get kids to school ready to learn, have proven themselves to be incredibly adaptive and incredibly responsive in crises. And I think that's the thing we're going to have to build on, right? So I think the first thing I would say to people is to stay engaged. Take advantage of things like this. You don't need to figure out all the problems on your own. STN's doing a tremendous service to the industry by putting out these type of forums and information that they're providing. So we want folks to not feel like they're in the wilderness having to figure this all out by themselves. So reach out to your peers, go to STN Online, go look for information, because there are others, and we've used this term a couple of times throughout, but there are others in the tribe out there who are facing the same problems that you are. And I think importantly at DSG, we're huge believers in the idea of interdisciplinary teams, because we think everybody can learn from somebody. We have all these mechanics and drivers who are expected to be delivering services in the fall who are sitting on the sidelines right now. I think we bring them in and we get them involved in the game plan, right? Find out what they're worried about, find out what their concerns are, what their ideas are, and get them focused on fixing them, right? We have a structure that we like to use where teams are given defined scopes of responsibility and authority, and it's their job to solve problems and bring them back to the department for implementation. It's not easy, it's not fast, but it can be really effective. And it can be really effective because it gives you a flexibility that hierarchical decision-making doesn't. Because as problems emerge, you can reassign teams for it and not distract yourself from the day-to-day. So the idea of not relying on the one or two smart people coming down from the mountain with all the questions, all the answers, and all the ideas, I think is a great way to think about it. And the last thing I would have to suggest is don't wait. I think we have to use every minute of every day, because the scope of the things that we're dealing with here are big, they're novel, and they're cross-cutting. So we're going to need a lot of heads to be nodding to make the changes that we need to make. I think if I was to recommend anything to anybody, it would be get up tomorrow, start inventorying the challenges that you think you might face, and then figure out who the people are who are around you who can help, and start dividing up the work. Right. And if I could just say one last thing, I really appreciated what Corey said last week when he mentioned how underappreciated this industry is in the education community. I think he's right. But I also think that transportation is going to be the linchpin of successfully transitioning millions of families back to some sense of normalcy. It's a massive challenge, and it's going to be a massive responsibility. But the people in this industry have always been good at responding to both of those things. And I'm really confident that they're going to be able to do that again in the face of these crises.
Yeah, really, really good stuff. Tim, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you and leverage the brain power of DSG to help them get on track, how do they contact you? Who do they call?
Sure. They could certainly, reach out email-wise. Email address is tammon@decisionsupportgroup.com. Call us on our 800 number, which is 800-994-0483. And they could certainly go to the website, decisionsupportgroup.com, and reach out to us from there.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. School Transportation Nation, we got a big task ahead of us. with what's to come. And I want to extend a special thank you to our friends at TransFinder for sponsoring this podcast. Also want to remind you, friends, that on stnonline.com to read Tim's blog post. We'll keep you updated on coronavirus and everything in the school transportation industry. Don't forget to subscribe to the School Transportation Nation podcast through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I will see you next time, friends. Me, Mr. Ryan Gray, we're signing off and send you the best. Take care. Be healthy and safe.